Hi there, my name's Dave Holmes. Welcome to cyclingphysio.com. In this episode we're going to be talking about back pain, and this is the first episode that we're going to talk about back pain. Obviously it's a very complicated subject. There is a lot of different causes and reasons for back pain, but I'm going to talk about the one that I find is the most common, especially amongst cyclists. And it doesn't really have a name in the literature, but I'm going to call it Lumbo-sacral syndrome. Okay, so essentially how this develops, it starts from a muscle imbalance and a postural dysfunction. So you know me, I'm always talking about weakness of the glutes. Now it's very common for the glutes to become weak for a variety of reasons, as I've discussed elsewhere. Essentially what we need to know though is when that happens, a change occurs in the posture. It's a bit chicken and egg. You might get the weakness in the glutes because of this change in the posture, but I think the posture comes later. And what we should see in normal good posture is the hip bones here, the pointy bones on the side of the hip, should come directly above the little bony lump on the side of your ankle. Now, the most common postural fault is what's called the classic sway back. Okay, not the true sway back, but what we call a classic sway back. Now, a classic sway back, that little lumpy bone of your hip, instead of falling right above your ankle bone, it kind of comes forward and is falling above the arch of your foot. And that is, I would say, 8 out of 10 people, that's the way they stand. Okay. Now, a true sway back, that bone would be way out over your toes, and it's very rare. You don't usually see a sway back that's quite that dramatic. Now, what that creates in the spine is a movement dysfunction. Essentially what happens is when you drift forward like that, your spine back bends a little bit, but now not the whole spine, not in a classic sway back. In a true sway back you do get a very sharp backward bend of the spine. But in the classic sway back, it's such a subtle movement that really the only thing that is affected is this bottom vertebrae that is the junction between the lumbar spine and the sacrum. That's why I call this Lumbo-sacral syndrome. And essentially it comes into a back bend. And this bottom joint here becomes placed in its end range of extension, or near its end range of extension. Now, that's not a big deal over a short period of time, but if you do that over the course of several years, what happens is this joint here becomes tight and stiff and loses its ability to come forward into a forward bend. Okay, so it's stuck in a backward bend and it loses its ability to come forward. Okay, now that is a problem if you're a cyclist, obviously, because we spend a lot of time bent forward over our handlebars. But this isn't a problem just related to cyclists, because when people sit, we also have a tendency to flatten our low back, which is essentially a forward bending motion. So people who get a lot of a lot of pain with prolonged sitting, this is also a problem. Okay, and most commonly this is what people are dealing with. And why it becomes painful actually isn't much to do with that tight joint. The tight joint is tight, but it usually isn't the one that's producing the pain. Where the pain is coming from is, now this joint here, again, it's stuck in a bit of a backward bend. When you go to do a forward bend now, the one above it has to bend excessively to compensate for the fact that this one won't bend. Now that's a very tricky problem to solve, because what happens over time, this one becomes quite loose into a forward bend, and this one is allowed to get tighter and tighter. So from a manual therapy standpoint, it's very difficult to loosen this joint without putting force through this joint, which is the sore one. And again, when we look at some of our common stories of back pain, people, they're okay if they sit perfectly, they support their low back when they sit, they're all right. But every once in a while when they go to bend forward, they get this real sharp catching pain, or they'll put their back out, as they always say. And what that is a spraining or irritation of that joint second from the bottom, because as you went forward, you rapidly and without control bent at that spot, and it overbent, and you basically sprain this joint, or even worse, tear and irritate the disc because it gets overstretched. The solution to lumbosacral syndrome is to actually do two things. First of all, the number one thing is to make this bottom joint here actually bend again. Alright? Now that's a very difficult thing to do and requires a lot of skillful manipulation, because it's very difficult to keep the force of bending away from that loose one above it that's sore. But we do have ways that we can do that. Now once we get that joint moving, the next focus has to be on restoring the normal muscle tone through the glutes so that you're not standing with that hip forward posture. And that the other thing that happens when the glutes are weak is if you're not extending and driving your walking motions and your cycling motions and your basically any of your motions through the hip, if you're not doing that from the glutes, you're going to do it from the low back, which is going to shut that spot back down again. So strengthening and balancing out muscle imbalance through the hip is a key to prevention of this, or to keep it from coming back. And the third thing we need to do is work on some of the deep muscles of the abdomen and the low back to try and stabilize that loose joint second from the bottom to make sure that it no longer moves excessively.